Today's video is about the hopes and expectations that every player is going to have as we draw closer to the release of the first season of Midnight. The expansion, actually, is going to be out in about 2 weeks, a bit over 2 weeks, and then the actual season, though, we have to wait 5 weeks for that. But right now, it's already the time where players start testing all of the specs now that the 12.0.1 version of the pre-patch, so even further changes to the specs and even the UI have gone through. Players start to think about their mains, and of course what comes with thinking about your main is, you know, thinking that what you are playing is going to be good in the next expansion. Unless you are sadistic and you just want to play a spec nobody wants and nobody wants to see in their own groups in the next expansion. So in our rating levels, in terms of wishful thinking and what we hope to see in the next expansion, you obviously have the highest one, which is the dream of being meta and wanted in both Mythic Plus and the raid at the same time. That would be, of course, the best case scenario. Then you have the second one, which is being meta in Mythic Plus only, because, you know, the raid is way more flexible. There are way more options for you to play in a raid with that many more players available, but in Mythic Plus is a much more competitive environment for the few spots that can be strong, so it's more valuable for you to be meta in Mythic Plus. Then you have being meta in the raid, being strong and wanted in a raid environment, as a DPS in particular, but even as a healer, it's pretty valuable. And then you have mediocre, you know, mid-average specs that don't get to be the strongest ones either in Mythic Plus or the raid, followed by, of course, the worst ones, the more abandoned ones, the more underplayed and just not really relevant to both the raid and Mythic Plus. So in a mix of predictions and also wishful thinking, both based on what we have been seeing in the Midnight beta because of the performance of these specs for now, and also based on what we have seen already in previous seasons and previous expansions and who we have seen meta or not seen meta for too long, for tanks we could say it might look something like this. You have Brewmaster as the very first, followed by Havoc Demon Hunter, Protection Paladin, with Guardian and Prot Warrior still being okay, and Blood DK all the way down over here. There is a pretty good advantage right now for Brewmaster, simply because not only are they the strongest tank in Mythic Plus as we have covered already, but also they are a staple of raid tanking. What's even better for Brewmaster is that being a monk and bringing a raid debuff at the moment, Mistweaver is not particularly good in the raid, and neither is Windwalker. So you have an even higher chance of your token monk being brought in the raid being Brewmaster, but there are very good hopes right now for Brewmaster. Vengeance, on the other hand, very rarely ever gets to this point, simply because you have traditionally had very often a Havoc Demon Hunter doing nicely in the raid, and because Vengeance as a tank in the raid doesn't really offer you anything special or anything extra, so it's rarely become a staple or as a tank in the raid anyways. Meanwhile, for example, the complete opposite being Prot Paladin. Even when they haven't been meta in Mythic Plus, they have often been one of the tanks of choice when it comes to the raid. Technically, there could also be some decent hope for Blood DK for being a passable tank in the raid as usual, but given the poor attention given to other tanks right now of Blood in the beta, we have decided to put them at the lowest of the low. Now for healers, you have a pretty clear start, obviously, because we have checked this out also at length. Restoration Druid has been the staple meta healer in the beta, so if you go by both your predictions or your hopes of who gets to be strong in the next season, Resto is the number one in line for Mythic Plus. It doesn't get to be as high as Brewmaster simply because their performance, at least when it came to testing in the raid, wasn't anything special, anything particularly good, so it would be hard to also imagine them to be a staple in the raid as well. If we have to go the opposite side and purely consider their performance in the raid, for example, and also how historically they have been very good in that setting, then you would put Preservation and Discipline to also be very good in the raid. The other healers right now are more of a question mark based on both their performance and popularity in the raid or in Mythic Plus. You could argue, for example, that when you talk about spot healing, Holy Priest also being buffed significantly recently could also be a pretty good pick for the raid because of their power in single target healing. But also after the buffs, for example, Holy Paladin could be quite stronger when it comes to Mythic Plus as well, at least compared to the other healers that we have seen. Still definitely far below the current power level of Resto Druid, but it is definitely in a much better state than they were before. Now, when it comes to the DPS specs, well, again, by not even looking at our preferences or our biases or our hopes of the specs we like, want to see them doing well, and simply looking at what they did in the beta, then you would have to put already by default specs like Demo all the way up over here, specs like Arcane, specs like Augmentation Evoker. Those are the ones that were doing overwhelmingly the best when it came to both of the activities, the raid testing and then the Mythic Plus popularity right now. Those three specs were definitely high up. You also had some particular highlights when it came, for example, to Mythic Plus only. There were a few specs that were doing well there without doing well in the raid, like for example Unholy DK, but also specs like Frost Mage, specs like Survival was actually even doing quite well in Mythic Plus, as well as Devourer, Demon Hunter doing very well in Mythic Plus, and even Outlaw as the best performing ones of the rogues. Now, when it comes to the raid, obviously, by this point, the latest of the raid testing is like 3 resets ago. There have been like 2 different rounds of balance tuning in the middle. Things might change a lot, but based on how these specs were doing, and also how traditionally some of these specs always squeeze in one way or another in your comps, BM was doing well, Sub was doing well, Devastation Evoker was also doing well, and the last one of the do-wellers was Affliction Warlock. Now, the other specs have been the ones that have been more or less left out. The unluckiest one of the ones being left out has been Havoc Demon Hunter, for the simple reason that over time there have been more and more popularity. You can understand it, to be fair, for Devourer, being the new spec, being the new thing. Think about, for example, the fact that at the moment there are more than 30 times more Devourer Demon Hunters in the beta in Mythic Plus compared to Havoc, for example. Their performance in the raid was much closer. Neither of them were that good to be considered in here anyways, but it might be a little bit unlucky. Perhaps there are going to be way more Havoc Demon Hunters now moving over to Devourer at the beginning of the season if Devourer ends up being the better performing spec. You could say the same, to be fair, about a few other of these specs. For example, Marksmanship not doing nearly as well as BM is expected to be left out much more. Obviously, another classic in this case, given the power of these two specs, would be Fire Mage. Another one would be Destro Warlock compared to both Affliction and Demonology. You have a couple of usual ones being abandoned, like Assassination Rogue and Feral, as well as a couple of specs quite annoyed about the recent treatment and general direction of their tuning, both Arms and Fury Warrior, not excelling in either Raid or Mythic Plus in the beta so far. Talking about specs being hurt by other being strong or stronger, you also have Frost DK being a bit overshadowed by Unholy DK. There have also been quite middling specs, but perhaps almost good enough to make it one way or another, like Elemental in the raid. Elemental was doing good single target damage. Now, in Mythic Plus they weren't nearly as popular, but their Farseer build in the raid was doing well enough. You could expect them to still be doing nice, especially if you consider you still want kind of a shaman in your raid, you want your mastery buff. It's not that enhancement was doing very well, actually. In terms of tuning, their tuning was not good at all. Despite the applauses and the excitement and praises of the player base because they like how enhancement plays. It's one of the few specs that survived the pruning in terms of how their spec have been simplified and made worse in how it plays. Enhancement is still playing very nicely, it's just that at the moment their issues have been more around the tuning of their damage, more so than how the spec plays. Yes, it's sad that specs with 2 buttons or 3 buttons are faring or looking to be doing much better than them in terms of damage, but all this would need is just a few balance tuning passes for enhancement to be immediately high up again. Specs that would need more than just a few tuning passes because of how badly they have been hurt by the pruning, for example, has been Windwalker Monk. A few confusing decisions in the philosophy of the spec. Initially everyone was happy because Torment and Fire was removed, and then you get to play with Slicing Winds. You have to choose if you want to keep or not your Whirling Dragon Punch. Not too many good decisions right now going the way of Windwalker, on top of the fact that their current tuning is not very good. Ret was also doing quite poorly, both in Mythic Plus and the Raid. Quite a surprise, because traditionally Ret is, as usual, one of the most popular spec everywhere. No matter where you go, no matter what stats you look, Ret, together with BM, generally ends up being the most popular spec. Not really in the beta, not really in the participation in both the Raid and Mythic Plus. There weren't many of them, and they weren't doing that nicely either. Then you finish with 2 more specs comfortably middle of the pack in Balance and Shadow. They do both have possible, potential of being both here or here. If you're very lucky, you might even end up here, but in terms of AoE damage, especially things like cleave, split, cleave, like for example a few bosses will be with that kind of damage profile in the raid, both of these might have a very easy time becoming very wanted in the raid because of their damage, the dot damage profile they have. But right now, overall, just by looking at the results they have gotten so far, they haven't done neither too badly or too well to be too excited about them. This is how we would look at the specs if we were to judge them purely based on what we have been seeing in the beta, so translating their performances from the beta to the live version of the game. Obviously, a few of these specs have more problems than just receiving some 10% more damage or 10% more healing. Some of these definitely can jump, as we just had the example of enhancement, just by getting some tiny tuning. For example, buffing the damage of arms by 10% could bring them back up to being very good in the raid as a single target spec, or maybe continuing, as Blizzard has been doing, to buff Fire Mage to the point where they become actually good again. And then there are other specs that might have some more critical mechanical problems due to the damage they suffered from the pruning and the things they have lost. I've seen many players actually complain about the state of Ret after their removals, as well as Windwalker, as well as Feral, as well as Assassination, as well as Marksmanship Hunter. So for these, the situation might be a bit more complicated than that. To be fair, sure. We could say the same about the ones at the top. Maybe Blizzard is not okay with some of these specs performing currently much better than others, like for example Demo, which was nerfed already, but didn't really matter, continued to perform extremely well. Or maybe Blizzard still isn't happy about Resto Druid in Mythic Plus, wants to continue to nerf Resto Druid in Mythic Plus. Maybe they might even lose out to something like Holy Paladin in terms of Mythic Plus specs. So even at the top, you definitely still have ways of dropping down purely based on a few notes in the balance tuning that will be from now to the release of the season. So we have, I think, 5-6 resets worth of tuning for some of these situations to move around, but purely based on what we can observe in the beta. This is what the specs have been doing so far in terms of performance. The more accurate one is definitely the Mythic Plus one, because Mythic Plus has dozens of runs every day at very high level. You get to see this microcosm of a meta forming in the beta with all of these finished and fully working specs. Meanwhile, the raid comp, there is like one testing a month. It's for like an hour per boss. There is no time to proper form actually efficient comps for each boss, so you don't get to see this nearly as much or with as much precision, with as much certainty as Mythic Plus. So the raid one is definitely the more fickle one in terms of possible power of certain specs. But this is what we see for now, which is another one of our snapshots. One of the things we can then in the weeks following go and pick back up to then compare what is changing patch by patch or tuning by tuning to see what in here is changing based on the Blizzard's balancing. But for today though, on this Wednesday, on this weekly reset in EU as well, this is what we had for today. We are now leaving with our goodbyes by thanking everyone for having watched the video, together with, of course, everyone else who's been supporting Competitive for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, I was trying to be below 15 minutes. We had to really risk it.